Hey everyone! Today we're diving into one of the most incredible stories from ancient history, the Revolt of Spartacus. This gladiators' uprising, which took place between 73 and 71 BCE, was the most successful slave rebellion Rome had ever seen. You might know it as the Third Servile War, but what makes it truly legendary is how it captured the imagination of historians, filmmakers, and even political thinkers like Karl Marx. Spartacus has become a symbol of resistance and freedom, but was he really the heroic freedom fighter we often imagine? Let's start by understanding that Spartacus wasn't out to overthrow the Roman system or lead some grand revolution for justice. In reality, he was just a man who had endured too much and decided one day that enough was enough. His revolt actually started almost by accident. According to Plutarch, one of the ancient historians, Spartacus and his fellow gladiators were just trying to escape when their plan was discovered. They had two options: fight for their freedom or be executed. So they fought, and they fought well. Now, over time, Spartacus' story grew beyond the reality of the moment. By the 18th century, especially in France, he was being seen as a symbol of rebellion against oppression. But back in 73 BCE, Spartacus' motivation wasn't some lofty goal to free all slaves. It was simply about securing his own freedom. To truly understand the weight of this rebellion, we need to talk about what slavery was like in ancient Rome. Slavery wasn't just a side note in Roman life, it was everywhere. Slaves worked in households, fields, mines, workshops, and even in the city. In fact, in Italy alone, as many as 1 in 3 people were slaves. The historian Mark Cartwright explains that the entire Roman economy relied on the forced labor of slaves. Rome's economy was driven by two main engines: agriculture and war. Roman soldiers, most of whom were farmers, spent long periods away from their land due to military campaigns. When their farms went bankrupt, wealthy landowners bought them up and used slaves to work the land, creating massive estates. As Appian tells us, these rich landowners used either persuasion or outright force to grab as much land as they could, filling their estates with slaves to avoid sending free men to the army. Slaves came from many sources. Some were war captives, like the 75,000 captured during the First Punic War. Others were victims of piracy, trade, or simply born into slavery. The infamous slave markets, such as the one on the island of Delos, were filled with people who had been reduced to commodities, sold with signs around their necks advertising their skills. In ancient Rome, slaves did everything. They worked the fields, served in households, tutored children, and even fought for entertainment as gladiators. Their treatment depended entirely on their masters. Seneca, a Roman writer, gives us a glimpse into just how brutal life could be for a slave. He describes a scene where house slaves stood in silence as their masters gorged themselves at dinner. Even a cough or sneeze could result in a beating. According to Seneca, slaves weren't even treated like people, more like animals or objects. This kind of cruelty was so common that it became normalized. The rich saw it as their right to treat slaves however they pleased, and slaves were expected to obey without question. Some, like Diogenes of Sinope or the philosopher Epictetus, were treated well and even became part of their master's family. But for most, life was harsh and freedom seemed like an impossible dream. Now, if life as a house slave was hard, being a gladiator was even worse. Gladiators were slaves whose only purpose was to fight and die for the entertainment of the Roman crowds. They were chosen for their physical strength, and while some could win their freedom through exceptional performances, most lived and died in the arena. And Spartacus? He was one of these men. Born in Thrace, a region north of Macedonia, Spartacus had once fought against the Romans before being captured and forced into slavery. And after he was captured and sold into slavery, Spartacus ended up at a gladiator school in Capua, run by a guy named Lentulus Badiatus. This wasn't your average training school. The slaves here were trained under harsh, brutal conditions, meant to break their spirits and mold them into obedient fighters for the entertainment of the Roman crowds. But in 73 BCE, Spartacus had enough. Along with a group of about 200 other slaves, he plotted an escape. Unfortunately, word got out, and Spartacus knew the authorities would come down hard on them, probably torturing and killing them all. So, instead of waiting to be captured, Spartacus acted. He led 78 of his fellow slaves in a breakout, raiding the kitchens for knives and spits to arm themselves. After killing their captors, they fled to the countryside and eventually made camp on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. At this point, the group chose their leaders, Spartacus, along with two others, Oenomaus and Crixus. But pretty quickly, Spartacus took charge of the whole operation. He wasn't just a strong fighter, he had a sharp military mind, and he knew how to lead. As they raided nearby areas for supplies, Spartacus made sure to share the loot equally, which earned him even more followers. Before long, word of the revolt spread, and slaves from all over the region started joining him. At first, the Roman Senate didn't take the rebellion seriously. They figured it was just a group of runaway slaves, and they sent a general, Gaius Claudius Glaber, with a small, inexperienced force to crush the revolt. Glaber wasn't too worried. He surrounded Spartacus and his men on the mountainside, thinking they'd starve them out. But Spartacus was a lot smarter than the Romans expected. Using the thick vines on the mountain, he had his men weave ladders and climb down a side that Glaber had completely overlooked. In a surprise move, Spartacus attacked Glaber's forces from behind, caught them off guard, and wiped them out, seizing their weapons in the process. After that victory, the Roman Senate realized this wasn't just some small-time rebellion. They sent another general, Publius Varinus, with a larger force to take Spartacus down. Varinus made the mistake of splitting his forces, thinking he could trap Spartacus. Instead, Spartacus crushed him so thoroughly that Varinus even lost his own horse in the battle. With every victory, more and more slaves joined Spartacus, swelling his numbers to around 70,000. The Romans were getting nervous now. This was no longer just a nuisance, it was a full-blown crisis. The Senate called in the big guns, sending consuls Publicola and Claudianus to take him down. Spartacus was now controlling large parts of the countryside, and his army was growing every day. But here's the thing, Spartacus wasn't planning to march on Rome itself. His goal wasn't to take over the city but to get out of Italy altogether and lead his followers back to their homes. To do that, he had to cross the Apennine Mountains. Since his army was too big to move as one, he split his forces in two, with Crixus leading one group and Spartacus the other. This turned out to be a costly move. The Romans attacked Crixus's forces first, and despite putting up a tough fight, Crixus's group suffered heavy losses, and Crixus himself was killed. Spartacus, however, managed to defeat Claudianus and then took on Publicola, driving him from the field. Afterward, Spartacus honored Crixus in a rather brutal fashion. He sacrificed 300 Roman prisoners and even staged gladiatorial games using the captured Romans as fighters, just like in the arenas where he once fought. It was his way of turning the tables on Rome, no longer a gladiator himself, but the one calling the shots. With his forces now numbering over 120,000 infantry and an unknown number of cavalry, Spartacus began his march toward Rome. So, Spartacus had been doing pretty well, right? He had this growing army of former slaves, and after defeating multiple Roman forces, he was in control of large parts of Italy. But something changed. For reasons we'll never really know, Spartacus decided to abandon his original plan to lead his army out of Italy to freedom. Instead, his forces turned south. Now this rebellion had been going on for about 3 years, and the Romans were starting to freak out. At first, they thought it was a joke, just a bunch of runaway slaves causing a little trouble. But as Spartacus kept winning battle after battle, they realized this was a serious problem. The Roman Senate had already replaced the failed generals Publicola and Claudianus, and they brought in a new commander, Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus wasn't messing around. He was determined to end this rebellion, and he knew he had to whip his soldiers into shape. So he used a brutal method called decimation. He literally had every 10th man in his legions executed as punishment for their past failures. Crassus was making it clear, fear him more than the enemy. He marched south, toward Bruttium, where Spartacus was trying to link up with the Cilician pirates. Spartacus had this plan to capture the Roman-controlled island of Sicily and set up a free state for his followers. But the pirates never showed up. Spartacus was left stranded, with the sea behind him and Crassus' army in front. To make things worse, Crassus had his troops build a wall, trapping Spartacus and his army. Crassus thought he could just wait it out, let hunger and desperation break Spartacus' forces. And Spartacus did try to break through the Roman lines, but his attack failed, and he lost about 6,000 men in the process. At this point, things were looking really grim for Spartacus. According to some sources, he even tried to escape by building makeshift rafts from beams and barrels, but that plan didn't work either. So what did Spartacus do? He switched to guerrilla tactics. He and his men started harassing the Roman forces with quick, hit-and-run attacks. There's even a story that he crucified a Roman prisoner between the two armies to show his men what would happen if they gave up. Spartacus was trying to keep their morale up, showing them that surrender was not an option. But Crassus wasn't in any rush. He was willing to sit tight and let time do the work for him. However, the Roman Senate wasn't as patient. They were getting nervous that Crassus might not be moving fast enough, so they called in another top general, Pompey, fresh off his victories in Spain. Now, Crassus knew Pompey would steal the credit if he didn't act quickly, so he ramped up his attacks. Spartacus, seeing the situation becoming hopeless, tried one last time to negotiate with Crassus, but Crassus wasn't interested in talking. Realizing that there was no way out, Spartacus made a final stand. In a legendary moment, when his men brought him his horse before the battle, Spartacus killed it. He said something along the lines of, "If I win, I'll have plenty of horses to choose from. If I lose, I won't need one." With that, he led his army into what would be their last battle. Spartacus himself charged straight toward Crassus, cutting down 2 centurions in the process. Even though he didn't reach Crassus, Spartacus fought bravely, refusing to back down. According to one account, even after being wounded by a spear in the leg, he dropped to one knee and continued to fight until he was completely surrounded and killed. The exact details of Spartacus' death are a little murky. None of the ancient sources agree on what happened to his body. It was never identified. But what we do know is that Spartacus died fighting, refusing to surrender even when the odds were impossible. Crassus might have won the battle, but Pompey swooped in just as things were wrapping up. His troops captured and killed the fleeing slaves, and Pompey made sure to claim most of the glory for ending the rebellion. He even sent a message to the Senate boasting about how he had dug the war up by the roots. Meanwhile, Crassus got a much less prestigious reward for his victory, an ovation, which is basically a low-key version of a Roman triumph. In a final, gruesome display of power, Crassus ordered the crucifixion of 6,000 surviving slaves along the Appian Way, the road leading from Rome to Capua. Their bodies were left hanging there as a brutal reminder to anyone else who might be thinking about rebellion. Now, even though Spartacus didn't live to see freedom, his story didn't end with his death. While Roman historians mostly saw him as a dangerous rebel, many also seemed to admire his courage and military skill. Spartacus had managed to challenge Rome for years, and that was no small feat. Over time, his story was retold and reinterpreted, turning him from a simple gladiator seeking his own freedom into a symbol of resistance against oppression. In the 18th century, writers and artists in Europe started comparing Spartacus to modern-day revolutionaries. His story was taken up by people fighting for freedom from tyranny, first in France, then Italy, and even during the Haitian Revolution. And of course, in the 20th century, Spartacus became a worldwide symbol thanks to books, plays, and movies, especially the famous 1960 film directed by Stanley Kubrick. That movie cemented Spartacus as a hero for the ages, a symbol of the fight against injustice and oppression. In reality, Spartacus probably wasn't trying to overthrow Roman society or end slavery. He just wanted freedom for himself and his followers. But his story has become much bigger than that. He's become a symbol of standing up to overwhelming odds and fighting for what's right, no matter the cost.